Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel.
Today, we're journeying into the heart of Southern African history to uncover a pivotal, yet often overlooked chapter. The First Chimurenga, a powerful war of resistance against colonial rule in what is now Zimbabwe.
This wasn't just a single battle, it was a widespread uprising by the Shona and Ndebele peoples, a defiant stand against the encroaching power of the British South Africa Company. To truly understand this conflict, we need to go back to the late 19th century. Imagine your land, the very ground your ancestors walked, being systematically taken from you. This was the reality for the Ndebele and Shona people.
In the 1890s, the British South Africa Company, led by the ambitious Cecil Rhodes, arrived with a thirst for gold and a hunger for territory. They used deceptive treaties, like the Rep concession signed with the Ndebele King Lobengula, to gain a foothold.
This concession, which Lobengula believed only granted limited mining rights, was twisted by the company to claim vast swathes of land, effectively dispossessing the local populations.
The most fertile lands were seized and given to white settlers, pushing indigenous communities into less productive areas called reserves. This land alienation wasn't just an economic blow, it was a spiritual one, severing people from their ancestral heritage.
But the company's exploitation didn't stop there.
They introduced a system of taxation designed to force Africans into the colonial economy. The most notorious of these was the hut tax.
Every household was required to pay a tax in cash. The problem was, most people didn't use cash.
Their wealth was in cattle and crops. So, how were they supposed to pay? The company had a simple, brutal solution: forced labor.
This system, known as chibaro, compelled men to leave their homes and work for long periods in mines or on settler farms for little to no pay. It was a vicious cycle.
You couldn't pay the tax without cash, and the only way to get cash was to work for the very people who were oppressing you. Conditions were horrific, and the system tore families and communities apart.
Another major source of tension was cattle. In both Shona and Ndebele societies, cattle were more than just livestock. They were a symbol of wealth, status, and spiritual connection. They were used for dowries, ceremonies, and as a community's bank. After the Anglo-Ndebele War of 1893, the British South Africa Company began confiscating massive herds of Ndebele cattle, claiming them as spoils of war. This act was a profound humiliation and an economic catastrophe. It struck at the very core of Ndebele identity and power, leaving them impoverished and resentful. This wasn't just theft, it was the deliberate dismantling of a way of life.
On top of all this economic pressure, the company actively undermined traditional leadership. Local chiefs and headmen who had guided their communities for generations found their authority eroded.
The BSAC installed its own native commissioners, who held the real power. These officials often bypassed or humiliated traditional leaders, treating them as mere puppets of the colonial administration.
This stripped communities of their governance and their ability to resolve disputes according to their own customs.
The spiritual authority of religious leaders was also challenged. For people whose social and political structures were deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs, this was a devastating blow. The entire social fabric was being unraveled, thread by thread.
By 1896, the situation had reached a boiling point.
The Ndebele, who had already been defeated in the 1893 war and had lost their king, Lobengula, was simmering with discontent.
A series of natural disasters, including a severe drought and a devastating rinderpest epidemic that killed up to 90% of the cattle, was interpreted by many as a spiritual sign.
It seemed the ancestors were angry, and the land needed to be cleansed of the foreign invaders. Spiritual leaders, like Limo, rallied the people, promising that the bullets of the white settlers would turn to water.
In March 1896, the Ndebele rose up in what became known as the Second Matabele War. They launched coordinated attacks on settler farms, mines, and small towns, catching the company completely by surprise.
Just a few months later, in June 1896, the rebellion spread to the neighboring Mashonaland. Here, the uprising was heavily influenced by powerful spirit mediums, most famously Mbuyi Nehanda Chavi Nyokasikana and Sikoro Kaguve.
Nehanda was a medium for one of the most revered ancestral spirits in Shona cosmology.
She and Kaguve became the spiritual and strategic heart of the Shona rebellion.
They used their immense authority to unite different Shona chiefdoms, many of whom had been rivals for centuries. They inspired warriors to fight, coordinating attacks and providing a powerful unifying ideology for the struggle.
Their message was clear:
drive the white settlers from the land and restore the old ways.
This coordinated uprising by two distinct groups, the Ndebele and the Shona, who had historically been adversaries, is what we now call the First Chimurenga, or War of Liberation. The fighting was brutal and desperate.
The Ndebele and Shona warriors, armed mostly with spears, shields, and old guns, used guerrilla tactics, taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain.
They besieged the main settler towns of Bulawayo and Salisbury, now Harare.
The British South Africa Company, however, was ruthless in its response. They called in reinforcements, including imperial troops armed with superior weaponry like the Maxim gun, an early machine gun. The company's forces adopted a scorched earth policy, burning villages, destroying crops, and showing little mercy to combatants or civilians.
One of the most infamous tactics used by the BSAC was the use of dynamite.
When Shona and Ndebele fighters retreated into caves, which were both defensive strongholds and sacred sites, the company forces would simply seal the entrances and throw in sticks of dynamite.
This resulted in the deaths of thousands of men, women, and children, a brutal tactic that left a deep scar on the collective memory of the people. Faced with this overwhelming and merciless firepower, the rebellions were eventually crushed.
The Ndebele resistance largely ended in late 1896 after Cecil Rhodes famously met with Ndebele leaders in the Matobo Hills. The Shona resistance, however, continued fiercely until late 1897.
The aftermath was devastating. An estimated 50,000 Africans were killed, compared to around 400 white settlers. The leaders of the Chimurenga were hunted down.
Mbuya Nehanda and Sikora Kaguvi were captured and, after a trial, were executed by hanging in 1898. Nehanda's final words before her death are legendary. She is said to have prophesied, "My bones will rise again," a powerful statement that would echo through the generations and inspire future freedom fighters.
The suppression of the first Chimurenga solidified British colonial rule in the territory they would name Rhodesia, but the story doesn't end there. The first Chimurenga was not a failure. Though militarily defeated, it became the foundational story of Zimbabwean nationalism. It was the first large-scale, unified resistance against colonial occupation, planting the seeds of a shared national identity. The memory of this struggle and the heroism of figures like Nehanda and Kaguvi was kept alive in songs, stories, and oral traditions. They became national symbols of defiance and the ultimate sacrifice for freedom.
Decades later, in the 1960s and 72nd, when a new generation of nationalists rose up to fight against the Rhodesian government, they called their struggle the Second Chimurenga. They saw themselves as the inheritors of Nehanda's prophecy, the rising bones she spoke of.
They drew direct inspiration from the courage and unity of their ancestors, transforming the legacy of the first Chimurenga into a powerful force for modern liberation.
So, the first Chimurenga stands as a crucial moment in history. It was a tragic and brutal war, born from the pain of dispossession and exploitation. But it was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unwavering desire for freedom.
It reminds us that history is not just a story of conquerors, but also a story of resistance, a story of people who, against all odds, dared to fight for their land, their culture, and their dignity. Thanks so much for watching.
If you found this dive into history valuable, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.
See you next time.